Welcome to folks joining via the recording. We will have quite a long discussion today because we got through the sort of community scale topics pretty quickly. So the first topic that we talked about a little bit last time and should come to some sort of agreement on the way forwards in this call is issue 107, link into the chat, and I will actually also share my screen for the recording. Into the chat, which is about asserting relationships between entities in a way that's sort of extensible and doesn't require minting a bunch of new relationships in an extension ontology. So we have already a good way of not minting a bunch of subclasses via P2 or classified as, but we don't have a good way of minting relationships. So apart from a very technical, semi-philosophical discussion, if you scroll back to about 28 days ago, Marilena and I put in a couple of examples of how this could look. But to Ethan's point of this morning, we should discuss the extent to which we think this is really in scope for linked art, or is this one step too far and that we should leave it alone completely? So first of all, any thoughts about the scoping? Ethan, do you want to jump in?
Sorry, I was muted. Yeah, I think that it would be good to have this discussion, but I don't think we should have it in a silo without input from other people doing prosopographical work and projects that are working on archival authorities and stuff like that. So the decisions that we would make are perhaps relevant to other projects. So if we're going to start discussing complex relationships between people and organizations, hopefully we can get other people on board with that from outside the Linked Art group.
Yeah, I think the complexity is an interesting point there as well. That I don't think we should be trying to do complex relationships. I think it should just be a patch to CRM to allow extended relationships. As simple as X is the student of Y or similar, which at least in the showcase discussion and certainly in our discussions here at the Getty internally has been a real need for being able to connect between things in a way that isn't sort of modeled at a super fine-grained level. So yeah, I take the point that this is very, this is broad. It's sort of a framework level thing rather than than specifically to art. Yeah, in terms of, for example, the showcase, being able to say that Stieglitz was the spouse of Georgia O'Keeffe, I'm pretty confident that we can't do that currently with Sign Up CRM at all, because there isn't a sort of generic relationship pattern. But if anyone can think of a way of modeling this without extensions, then that would be good, of course. Yeah, any other thoughts from other folks? Yeah. Pro or con? Oh yeah, Ethan.
Just because SciDoc CRM purists don't appreciate mixing and matching ontologies doesn't mean that, practically speaking, you can't create an extension to CRM or create a different ontology and sort of work it into the data model.
Mm-hmm.
You know,
agreed.
There's no rule that says you can't do that.
Yeah. Yeah. Any further thoughts about the scope of this one?
Well, I still have a scoping doubt about it, because it starts from, I mean, well, yeah, I'm wondering whether it's about, the problem is not that we should just trash this GitHub issue and start from a clean slate. I mean, the example is about a personal relationship, but the issues start with object relationship, I think, as I understand it. So if there could be an alignment between the example and the beginning, the opening of the issue, that may help deciding.
Yeah, the current discussion is about personal relationships, but I think that the need would also be appropriate for other sorts of entity.
I think it could, yeah. It's just that I'm feeling a bit lost. Well, the current process we have for almost all the other issues is fine. I mean, pointing to the documentation, saying, okay, we should change this, replace it by something else, is something that I like a lot. And I feel that the scoping discussion would be stronger if we would keep to this.
Mm-hmm. Yep. Any reactions to that? We can certainly close 107 and reopen a new issue that would make it easier, and then have people sort of put in their use cases so that we can really consider the.
Yeah, I think that sounds like a good idea, especially bringing it back to emphasizing alignment with other types of relationships between different types of entities, and getting examples for what types of relationships people do currently document in their CMS between objects, especially. I know is an area that we're interested in, being able to express those when it's not just a simple part of relationship.
Yep. And then in terms of technical scoping, as opposed to whether it is in scope or not.
Hello.
Hello.
Hello. Okay, it's Margaret. I was actually getting caught up. I've been traveling myself, and I was reading all of Pat's comments about getting off into the RDF semantics. I just wanted to point out that one of the ways that we have been working with our work has specifically been to work on the relationships between the entities. And that's how we came up with a deliberately small set of 11 relations to describe. In our case, we're a little bit more broader than specifically the art that you're working on, I think. But what we do is we relate the object, whatever's in an image that you might see in an image, to the image itself first. And then we're working on those relations that go from the object itself that's in the image to other objects outside of that. So then you could say something like, this image has in background a painting which was created by George O'Keeffe, who was studying with some, so and so. Like there would be a set of triple relationships that would link the objects together like this. So I'm just throwing that out there.
I think that's the approach that we do not want to take, because the number of relationships that we would need to create would be very, very high.
From object to object, right? But I think
no, between any two resources is the issue. And for people, the number of relationships that we have would already be in the hundreds, just off the top of our heads.
But what I'm getting at is that the relationship of something that you see in an image to the image itself.
Yeah, right, which is a very small aspect of what we're trying to do. That's only one very minor use case for the.
This is why this is a very interesting conversation, because I mean, if you are looking at the resource of the image itself is what is being shared in a linked data format, then then you are talking about what you're looking at in an image in order to like link to greater resources outside of the linked art community. So I mean, I agree that this is another point outside of the scope of this particular document, but I think it's an interesting point to discuss, which is because even though this is about the linked art within museums, there is a lot of work being done right now, for example, with Wikidata, that is doing similar things that has to do with the structured data on the commons, and they're doing similar types of work. So, I mean, it would be nice to, at least for me, to sort of understand, because I want to have a system that that supports this linked art concept. It would be nice to understand the difference in that, to me, in the linked art model versus and or side by side to something like initiatives that involve the Wikimedia Commons and Wikidata.
Okay. Yeah, we could talk about that at a different time, probably, I'm sure. But that really is not what we're talking about today.
No, I understand.
Sure.
Some of these things branch off of those topics. Some of these things, like relationships between relationships, because you are linking. I think Ethan said that we are linking with a broader community, or that's the goal.
Yeah. So then, one of the scoping questions that I think added a bunch of complexity was my ill-advisedly offhand comment at the end of one particular comment that we might also attach time span or place to the relationship to qualify, the time or location of when that relationship was somehow in effect. And we don't, I think, have actual use cases or data to support that. So I would propose in our new issue that we keep that as out of scope unless people have data to support the duration of relationships. So yeah, is that, do people have this requirement for sort of arbitrary relationships, or is it more just the ability to say that two things have a typed link?
This is Ethan, and yeah, we do actually have that, because our archival authority system is built on EAC CPF, which is an archival standard for authorities. And so we do actually have relationships that have start and end dates and place, and the other entity with which the relationship was had. And that's all inherent to the EAC-CPF model, which is one reason why, if we're going to have these discussions on complex relationships between entities, that we should do so with that community.
Yep.
Yeah, so that's, yeah, we definitely have that.
Mm-hmm. Does anyone else have that sort of information that they need to manage and would be able to expose? Marilena is not here, but I'm not certain whether she has the information or not, but it seemed like she had, off the top of her head, a pretty solid model for how to work with it. So I guess maybe the Zero Foundation does manage it. All right, well, as a proposal for how to move forwards, I suggest that, yeah, we do what was suggested and close this particular issue, 107, and reopen a new issue. People who have requirements in this area should please comment on the new issue to say, here is the sort of data that we have. Here are the sorts of relationships and the sorts of entities that are involved in those relationships. We can then, yeah, look at it, and to Ethan's point, perhaps involve some other folks or other ontologies. If the extent of the sort of more complex, time-bound or location-bound relationships sort of become too complex or too out of scope, too far removed from our core activities, then we can simplify back down, as simple as possible, but no simpler. And yeah, I'm reasonably confident that we can come up with something that is useful and implementable before October, such that we can then use some of these relationships for the showcase for the O'Keeffe relationships. Any further comments or questions on this particular issue, or everyone is happy with that direction? Okay, so the next issue is also a relatively old one, which is that originally, when we were working in the American Art Collaborative model, target model, we said, well, we can just use FOF page and FOF homepage to link from resources to a page about them, or the sort of preferred homepage about them. Then, in an attempt to be consistent, we said, well, we should use the same pattern of having AT300, 404, 670, or preferred term or primary term or similar, as a way to sort of tag the homepage as being the primary web page, the preferred page for this object. However, just because it's the homepage for that painting doesn't mean that it is the homepage for all things that it might be referenced from. So it's not the homepage, the primary web page for The artist. The artist very likely has a different homepage. So in the open, in a particular document, this is pretty clear, right? The painting is the subject of a web page, which is the primary web page for the painting. But in the open world, this is pretty disastrous because any homepage becomes primary for anything that refers to it. So the question then in issue 159 is, what do we want to do about that? Do we, as per David's comment, do we want to go back to the original plan of both page and both homepage, or do we want to say, the consistency by using preference is more useful than the downsides of the chances of collision, essentially. I think that the chances of collision are pretty low because you wouldn't assert references for every single entity that a particular page talks about. So while it's theoretically possible and hence not an optimal model, I think in practical terms it's not very likely that it would come up in real life. However, as more and more data is added into systems, the chance goes up. So that's the trade-off that I think we need to discuss for this issue. So any thoughts or comments or questions on what the issue is, or any suggestions as to routes forward?
So is the problem that a homepage could be the primary web page for two different entities?
That would be fine.
That would be fine. Okay.
Yeah, it's when it's the primary page for one entity and not the primary page for another entity that it still makes sense to have the other entity refer to it.
Mm-hmm.
So
okay.
the homepage of Blue 1 is the is the preferred page for the object, but it's not the preferred page or homepage for Georgia O'Keeffe.
Right.
Yeah. Bob.
So what about a situation where you're publishing information about an art object that, say, belongs to another institution? But yet you might have a page on a website you manage that displays primarily that external art object or information about it, maybe with a focus on some aspects that you want to highlight. Is this suggesting that that's kind of like, the user readable authority for that art object in the world, or just in the context of your data set?
Yep. Yes, good question. Given the scope of linked data and that we want to make a joint set of information, I think the scope is this is the homepage rather than this is my homepage for it. But yeah, as you imply, that would be quite tricky. So institutions will probably put their homepage for the object in because that's the data that they have, meaning that either the use of homepage as a property or simply tagging the thing as preferred, either will likely end up in some sort of collision.
To me, this feels
will there
very
be
much,
will sorry
to me, this
will there
feels
be an
very much-
issue when not
Go ahead.
you go ahead.
To me, this feels a lot like the previous conversation we were having, which is that we're looking for a way to add metadata to a relationship between two things. Because I don't, the entity of a web page, isn't in any, I don't think we can say that, the Getty's irises page is always a preferred thing. It's preferred for irises, but it's not preferred, in the context of our, site-wide search, or it's not preferred in the context of our essay on Van Gogh. And by saying that, that entity is a preferred entity without contextualizing, because it's only preferred in the context of that object. We've said there's a relationship between this web page and this this object, but it's the relationship that's preferred, not the thing itself. So I think I think that's, using things like FOF page and FOF homepage is a way to use properties, because what we're caring about is that relationship, not just asserting it on the document itself.
I also just wanted to bring up those cases where multiple prints of an image, especially in photography, exist of the same image. So if the Getty has the same print of a Walker Evans and the Met has the same print of a Walker Evans, what's considered the home page for that print from the same negative?
Yep. Yeah, that seems very very similar to Dave's comment as well. Yeah, that it's bigger than just a single institution at this point.
So I guess in those scenarios, I'd be interested in what the published records about the object are. Because the other way of looking, what it sounds like is happening here, is that the publisher of the data using the Linked Art API is asserting a preferred homepage for their record. And that doesn't preclude there being a reference at the object level between those records. Say when there are two prints of the two prints in different institutions, would there be two records for the objects? And in that case, is it okay for both both institutions to curatorially say, we have different preferred pages?
Yep, a good point. And yeah, I think if we did not allow the distinction between homepage and just some sort of page, some sort of related web page, I think people would instantly ask for it. The reference to the web level documentation seems like a pretty critical feature.
Right. And I think where I'm moving to there in my head is the question of whether what is trying to be asserted here is the homepage, which is a pretty strong thing to assert if you're doing it on behalf of the open web and the open world, or whether this is asserting the homepage in the context of this published data from this institution. I don't know if that helps sort of clarify what this is trying to do.
Yeah, I think we should try to be as practical as possible. And it seems highly unlikely that institutions will go through and change their links from their object records to the web pages that are primarily about them to pages that are not theirs. So I think it needs to be the local homepage as opposed to the global one.
Yeah, I mean, that sounds most plausible to me, and I wonder whether if that scope were explicit in the documentation, does some of the concerns about finding the one correct homepage go away?
Yep.
That does mean that if I think about in our case where we have a object in our provenance index that we also have in our museum, it would mean that I wouldn't be sure which of those is the, there's a page in both of our websites about that object in different contexts. Does that mean that we need to keep them as separate objects that are just related to each other so that they each can have the appropriate homepage? Or do we need something more granular?
I mean, I think that's an interesting sort of second order effect. And I guess what I'm saying is one way we could go is by saying that the institution sets its preferred page. Then in that scenario, what that does is push the institution to make a decision as to how to standardize its page within its data. And I'm not saying that's easy, but that sounds easier than doing it globally.
Yeah. And if there are 6 different contexts within an institution and they each have their own preferred page, it begins to sound more just like here is a reference to this thing, as opposed to this is the preferred reference to the thing, preferred web page about the...
Right.
But shouldn't the URI be the preferred page? Like the stable canonical URI should be the page that is the thing for the object that you want people to see, with both human and machine readable information?
Maybe. I think the issue here is one of API rather as well. So if in our case, we would want to publish our or we'll be publishing our data as data.getty.edu/blah blah 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 blah. But that isn't the collection homepage for the painting, say. That would be something with a more human-oriented URL, probably just getty.edu/art/collection/some slug. So I think there is a need to distinguish between the URI of the entity and a URI of a preferred human readable description of the entity.
This is going to sound a bit abrasive, but if your canonical URI isn't the human readable page that you want human beings to use, then you're doing it wrong.
I mean,
well, I think
I don't disagree with that, but I guess the issue is that there's an implementation cost. And actually going back to the other point about what to do about multiple copies or multiple objects or multiple records, I guess it's the question of whether the standard enforces that, so enforces that the human readable URI is the same as the data URI, or whether it allows both, but essentially peer pressure and convention move people to doing one.
Yep.
And I don't think it's bad for the standard. Again, with the multiple objects, if there are different divisions within an institution that each have their own record, if the institution wants to merge on having one preferred page, then it implies that they have to sort out their different divisions to use the same data model internally, because otherwise they'll end up with multiple home pages, preferred pages, sorry. So I think that's the balance. It's between the costs of implementation of forcing people to do it like the one true right way, but allowing them to maybe do something that's a bit less good, but which will hopefully sort of nudge them towards the right thing.
In Numisma, we have this the situation with similar situation with the British Museum, where the URIs are basically like a direct you to a system that doesn't really have that much useful information for a person to read, versus their sort of online database that most people actually use. And we simply used RDFS-C also, just to point to that other resource as a kind of web resource rather than a canonical URI for the object. But I think FOF homepage, according to the GitHub thing, would probably work just as well, except in the case where you may have more than one preferred resource, or I guess there should be one preferred resource and then some other alternatives maybe, but only one preferred one.
Yep.
Right, and I think that's what's in the documentation at the moment. Is that right? Just below home page, there's other pages.
Yeah, yeah. The model isn't right, but that is the text. That's what we.
So it's kind of like the rule of thumb. If you are not hosting the URI of the identity for that object that you're publishing about, then you should not publish a preferred homepage for it and defer to the entity that is hosting that.
Yeah, I think that's in the same vein as what Kevin was just saying. That sounds like a very good practice that we should encourage, but should not necessarily absolutely mandate it, but instead, use best practices and peer pressure to encourage people to do it correctly, but to at least do something if they can't do it correctly.
What's a use case where you're publishing linked data for an object that's not in your own collection?
We have a grant from the Crest Foundation to publish conservation and provenance data for the entire Crest gift, which consists of, I think, 4,000 works, but we only have 2,500 of them, and the other 1,500 have been distributed to other entities. So even though this is not yet involving linked data, I could imagine that it would, and I believe the Crest is interested in maintaining some of that data.
Yeah.
So it's sort of like supplementing other sources of data for objects that might already exist and have linked data published for them.
We also run into this when we are documenting exhibitions. We get lots of lone objects that we want to talk about in the context of the exhibition, but we aren't the owner of that object.
So
yeah, exhibitions is a great example. Yeah.
So an idea is, I mean, and this is something that we've worked with, is that if you do end up having an object URI or an object that becomes the canonical URI that becomes a node on linked data, then it becomes a lot easier for another borrowing institution to just use the other institution's subject URI, which would point it always right back to the canonical holder of that object's data, if that makes sense.
Yeah, and I think that would be the best practice if possible. It's whether or not we can, in a reasonable amount of time, get institutions to start to do that, and then
our system is doing that. So I have use cases to illustrate that, because I use things from Wikimedia and from other institutions that are openly licensed. Mm-hmm. with open licenses for sharing data all the time.
Yeah.
So
I don't think the licensing is a big concern here. Right. It's more about the curatorial control over how the thing is described. So right. To use exhibition right. as the use case. We want to be able to, of course, have a different label for the object, or different description that is tied to the exhibition, meaning we would still need to have some way to refer to the object in the context of the exhibition.
Right, but you should be able to just refer to that subject URI within of the other institution, so they have the control over the data that's described about that item. But I am curious about how that links with people who already think that they have created a canonical URI on a particular item that's held in the collections that are in some of the institutions, like Wikimedia, for example.
Yeah, I think we might be straying too far away from the topic. That's,
So
indeed, canonical URIs are a big problem, or a big question.
yeah.
But it's homepages are not necessarily canonical. They're simply preferred, and they're a web representation rather than identity.
So I'm going to say I like the idea actually of a preferred page, but I like that mostly because I think it will raise the right questions with an institution about whether to have one, how to do one, and essentially a curatorial level. What I'd be really interesting, I think exhibitions is a fantastic test case, is how institutions believe they would push out a linked art deployment in that case. Because to me, it feels like the practical ramifications are more important. So my assumption is that the sort of linked art API will always be built on top of whatever collection management system is running. So the question of how this all links together, I think, is really about what in practice happens in reality for an exhibition, and where, you know, do the titles and the notes and preferred pages go in the underlying system, and does that inform what the best way of doing it in linked art is? Or sorry, the one that's most likely to get uptake, should I say?
Yep. Yeah, thankfully, we don't need to solve exhibitions in general this calendar year, this calendar year. But I completely agree that exhibitions really are a really good use case to think through for questions like this. So my point being, if we can think through in the abstract what it would mean in the exhibition context, without necessarily modeling, going into the nitty-gritty of modeling exhibitions, that might be a good pattern.
Yeah, sorry, I wasn't meaning to suggest let's model the exhibition.
Yep.
I guess my question is more, in practice, what happens when there is a loan item? What goes into the local system? Sorry, the place that it has been loaned to. In terms of the collection management, you know, because that system is surely the thing that's likely to be have its data pulled out and turned into a linked art output. So that would be a reasonable indicator as to what sort of relationships are going to be least disruptive.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, any comments on that one from
Well, Rob, can you hear me?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
Okay. One thought I had is with regards to deaccession. I think when we have this preferred, but we also have other references. For example, the Getty has an object, and this object is also in the Getty provenance index. But then the Getty sells the object, so the Getty museum wouldn't have the preferred URI anymore, but it would still be the object identifiable in the Getty provenance index, for example. So I think having this as preferred and then having multiple of it, I think that is important, right?
Mm-hmm. Yep.
And would denote allowed.
Mm-hmm.
So I've got a naive question about this homepage thing. Do you really need to express this preference aspect, because that's what is controversial? And I mean, why aren't we basically just using the Getty concept for home pages?
So I think the issue of tagging the page as a home page is that it's the home page for something. So it's which is why I put these two topics back to back, the relationship one and this one. That it's about it is the home page for this particular thing, and it is not just the home page without reference to a thing. And thus, it could be that there is if we have a relationship pattern, indeed it could be that there is a relationship between the object and the web page, and that relationship is one of homepaginess, is homepage of. But this seems like something that is quite critical. It's not, it seems like something that everyone is going to want to be able to express, and hence importing something like photo homepage seems like the more appropriate route, but to me, but yeah, that I think that's the.
So I think I can understand that, but why still using the DIT concept of preferred and not the one of homepage directly?
Oh, sorry, I see. Yeah. So yeah, essentially to reduce the number of of terms used. So it's a web page, and it is preferred. Sort of seems to me more consistent with this is a name and it is preferred, or it is the identifier and it's preferred, or it's a dimension and it's preferred, and hence my framing of this as preference rather than a class on the resource. So for those other topics, name and identifier and dimension and so on, all of those don't run into this particular problem because they are local resources to the thing. Right? It is only the name of that particular object, and hence it can be preferred without colliding with something else. Or it's only the dimension of that object. So if it's the preferred dimension, that's doesn't run into open world issues. However, this one, although it is consistent with all of those other cases, it does have the collision problem, if that makes sense.
So, I mean, it feels like there's almost two issues here, which is the collision concern about the information that's on the page, but I'm finding it hard to think about that without knowing about the scope of what the preferred page or the homepage is for and who makes it.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
Mm-hmm.
Because it seems like empirically, for instance, there might be enough data somewhere to actually see how much of a problem the collision question is. But first of all, we need to know, well, how many preferred pages would be asserted to even run that test.
Yep.
And I think what's interesting about the preferred page is, am I right in thinking the main use case is essentially there's a lot of data, there's a lot of web pages, but at some point you want to automatically select, in a particular context, a preferred human viewable page to show on a screen.
Yep. Yeah.
Right. So I quite like the idea of being able to find that as an intersection of essentially authority, so an institution, and their assertion of a preferred page. Seems like enough of a dimension reduction to make that plausible.
Yep.
Yeah, I think for me, the question that I'm struggling with is if there is a web page that the Getty has for irises, and if I'm looking at the data that the museum has about irises, I would certainly want to link to that page. But if irises appears in the provenance index, in the context of the provenance index data, I would also like to link to that page. But it's probably not the preferred representation of irises for the provenance index. So I've got two objects. One is the provenance concepts, the historical record from that sale, which is talking about that object, and one is, the museum talking about it. So we have two different institutions, both of which want to reference that web page. But in one context, it's the preferred website. In another context, it's just a supplementary resource about that object. Mm-hmm. And so asserting preferredness means that in both of those contexts, it's preferred. And I'm not sure that's going to be true regularly.
But isn't that an issue of those two parts? So it depends whether you're asserting that preferredness with the authority of one of those departments or the whole institution.
Yep.
And then that sounds like an internal organization and curation question, which I'm kind of sorry to lob back at you, but I'm not sure we can sort of solve through a technical standard.
Yeah. Yeah, it seems like it's the same if the GRI and the museum were totally different institutions rather than being programs within a larger trust. It would be exactly the same problem, but with exactly the same solution. That both the issue comes when we want to aggregate the information, and then we need to make a choice. But the individual programs are will be, I would imagine, quite content with the Provenance Index having a homepage in the Provenance Index and the museum having a homepage in the museum. And it becomes indeed David and my problem of what to do at the triple store type of level when we want to build what does the Getty know about this object, and at which point we would need to make a decision as to which was the preferred homepage for the institution, which would probably be the museum, because that's going to have more information about it than the Provenance Index would.
Well, no, but I think it is that we don't have the. It is if the Getty has a record of that web page. That web page is either a preferred web page or a not preferred web page globally across our institution. So it's not, it's the homepage of Iris is we're going to mark as a preferred web page in our data in all contexts. Anywhere we would link to that page, assuming that we're seeing that data, that web page is preferred. So it has nothing to do with the object itself. We have just globally said that is the preferred web page.
All right, in the current model.
Yeah.
Yes, I think, well, actually, given that it's not the hour, for this issue, I think the proposal is that we should change the current model to use FOV page and FOV homepage, because then we still have lots of interesting questions, but we have reduced the problem space by one, in that it's no longer a global homepage. It's now at least the preference is a relationship with the resource that is the homepage of. And then we can continue to discuss how to deal with multiple homepages in the aggregate case, but at least it's not a global homepage for everything that refers to it.
Is FOV page intended to be used for one or more alternative pages that are not preferred?
Yes, yeah.
Okay. What about in the instance where the canonical URI is also the home page? Should it be assumed that if there is no FOV homepage in the data for an object, that the canonical URI is the home page? Or should the FOV homepage always be included, even if it's the same?
Yeah, that's a good question. Given the time, Ethan, could you ask that question into the issue, and
okay.
Take it up next time. So thank you, everyone. I will document that at least hopeful change proposal to move forwards. And yeah, Ethan, if you can put the question in, we can talk about it over the weeks. Thanks everyone for coming. Thanks to John for taking the notes. And we'll have another call in a couple weeks' time. Great. So thanks everyone. Talk later.
Thank you.
Thanks. Have a good one.
Bye now.
Bye all.